Well, good evening. So, you can always tell that there's military folks in the crowd. They respond to the salutation. So my comments this evening are going to, broadly speaking, try to cover two fairly large topics. One is how China views the world and some of the key shaping factors, and then how China views information and within that context, future conflicts. So when thinking about China, I'm always reminded of Airplane 2. First, the Earth cooled. Then the dinosaurs roamed. And then the Chinese showed up. And they proceeded to invent everything, or at least so they would claim. In Chinese displays, you see them creating agriculture and irrigation. There's actually some basis for the irrigation part. From the thousands of years of Chinese history, the Chinese long saw themselves as basically more advanced than their neighbors. This is why the Chinese considered all of their neighbors barbarians, because in many ways, China was more sophisticated, more cultured. It was certainly more populous. It governed a broader area. Even in those cases where China fell to outside forces, the Mongols and the Manchus in particular, the Chinese were somewhat like the Borg from Star Trek. That is, they assimilated those who had conquered them and made their technological and cultural distinctiveness part of China's own. So when you think about the Mongols, they started as a nomadic population, and by the time they were finished, they had conquered much of the known world from the Chinese perspective, but they governed it through Confucian ethics. They had settled down into cities wearing Chinese silk and wrote their memoranda or dictated it to people in the Chinese language. And the same was true for the Manchus. So from their perspective then, for the Chinese, theirs was a system that at the end of the day would tend to dominate. The Chinese also operated within a very different, broader regional context. Asia is not Europe. What do I mean by that? When we think about Europe and European history, we have a constant balance of power. Whether it is the rise of Napoleon, Hitler, the Kaiser, the Soviet Union, you had multiple major powers that would shuffle and reshuffle and reassemble and coalesce into coalitions that would face down the rise of a single hegemon. In Asia, we have a fundamentally different dynamic at work. We see bandwagoning not balancing. There is no instance through thousands of years of regional history of the Koreans and the Khmers allying against the Tang Dynasty, or the Japanese and the Vietnamese allying against the Southern Song, or the Han, or even the Manchus, or the Mongols. Instead, you had China, which, as you know, in Chinese, Zhongguo, is often translated as Middle Kingdom, but it could also be Central Kingdom. And along its periphery were tributary states, states that understood that it was in their interest to basically concede to China, typically, rather than aligning with each other against it. All of this changes, however, in the period between 1839 and 1949. And this is the so-called Century of Humiliation. And this is one of the key shaping elements for Chinese today, at least in terms of the Chinese leadership. Because for this period, unlike thousands of years previous to it, China lost control over its destiny. And it lost it in the most thorough way possible. It lost control over its own territory. Hong Kong was a sleepy little fishing village, blessed by a beautiful harbor, but not actually exploited very much, until it was taken away by Great Britain at the end of the First Opium War. And let's remember what the Opium War was about, right? In the most brutal terms, it was the right of the British to sell drugs to the Chinese population. And by losing that war, it was tantamount to imagine if the United States had fought a war against the Kali cartel and lost. And now when you go to McDonald's and ask for a Coke, they ask 1 ounce or 2. I mean, we laugh about that, but that is what happened to China. So Hong Kong was the product of the Opium War. Taiwan becomes an issue in 1895 because Japan wins the first Sino-Japanese War. Yeah, they were numbering them. And in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, Taiwan is ceded to Japan. So the Taiwan issue actually has been festering for quite a long time. China lost control over its economy. The entire concept of most favored nation trading status actually develops in the context of China when Great Britain says, here is the tariff we will let you set on British goods into China. And as you can imagine, for anyone setting their own tax rate, it's going to be low. And other nations said, well, we won't accept a higher tariff on our goods either. And by the way, you, China, cannot raise the tariff on any of our goods unless we acquiesce, which again, as you can imagine, no one tends to support raising their own taxes. So China could not even set its own tariffs. China lost control over its own diplomacy. And here one of the prime examples, sadly, is that of the United States. In 1945, we have the Yalta Conference. How will World War II resolve itself? Germany is mostly beaten, but we are still looking at the likelihood of an invasion of Japan, because this is pre-Alamogordo. And FDR promises Joseph Stalin control of key ports like Dalian and the Manchurian railway network that would tie Dalian to the Soviet rail network. These are Chinese cities and Chinese railways. But you know who wasn't present at Yalta? Chiang Kai-shek. So FDR is basically saying, I'm going to give you pieces of China. Don't worry, China will accept this. So Yalta in the Chinese mind is very much like in the Polish mind, the great betrayal over diplomacy. And finally, and perhaps most festeringly, was the issue of extraterritoriality. The idea that Chinese citizens in British, French, Japanese, German, Italian, Russian, and American concessions in cities such as Nanjing or Shanghai would be subject to foreign law. Some of you folks have probably helped negotiate SOFA agreements, status of forces arrangements. You know that the likelihood of an American soldier, sailor, Marine, or airman being subject to Philippine, Iraqi, even Japanese law is a very contentious one, and not one that is lightly given away. And yet in their own country, Chinese are being told, you will be tried under British law if you attack a British citizen, all right, or if a British citizen is accused of attacking you, or French, or German. I mean, this for a country that for thousands of years had been the center of an entire continent. You can imagine how well this goes over. Now, the center of humiliation is driven not just by foreign exploitation, but also by domestic disunity. Because during this period, 1839 to 1949, China is not only facing outside aggression, but faces multiple civil wars. First, we have the Taiping Rebellion. 20 million dead. Bloodiest war of the 19th century. I'm sure all of you are very, very familiar with all of the people, all of the battles, all of the incidents, because something like this, I mean, nobody's going to ignore it, right? This is part of that century of humiliation. This is what the Chinese remember. In a nutshell, Heng Shouquan, a Chinese failed a person who wanted to become an official and failed the exams, basically gets it into his head that he is Jesus Christ's younger brother and starts a religious-based war to topple the Manchus, who are outsiders, and establish a new kingdom within China. So we have religious pieces, we have ethnic pieces, we have foreign pieces, and we see the importance of good translation, because he got his ideas from apparently a very bad translation of the Bible. So, 20 million dead, bloodiest war of the 19th century. Done, by the way, mostly with swords and spears and things like that. So by comparison, the 1911 revolution was a fairly minor skirmish, only about 2 million dead. Yeah, when you're talking about Chinese wars, you use the word only and millions of casualties. It's a little surreal. So the 1911 revolution is the revolution that topples the Qing dynasty and brings about the Republic of China. Those of you who saw Bernardo Bertolucci's The Last Emperor, That is the conflict that is being chronicled there in the life of the last Qing dynasty emperor. That revolution ultimately was arguably abortive. It did not lead to a democracy. It led to a series of warlords, military dictators, regionalism, that was ultimately resolved by Chiang Kai-shek, who then gets into a very long civil war with the Chinese communists. And that's the third of the major civil wars. But just for a little variety, they break up the Chinese Civil War by inserting the Second World War in the middle. So essentially from roughly 1927 until 1949, China is being fought over, whether between nationalists and communists, things like the Long March, war, communists, nationalists, and the Japanese in a truly three-way conflict from 1937 to 1945. Or you have the Chinese Civil War Part 2, 1945 to 1949. So all of this concludes in 1949 with Mao Zedong standing atop Tiananmen Square, waving in black and white, because they haven't invented color yet, and announcing that China has now stood up. He defeats Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists who are driven to Taiwan, which is the basis of the current cross-straits problem. Note that this is not about independence, at least in 1949. But it is about a China that formally ends the century of humiliation. And upon this aspect, the CCP legitimacy is built. We have in 1949 essentially an implicit bargain of three elements. One, there was incredible economic inequality, and the Communist Party of China was going to end that. I mean, very old-fashioned Marxism, Leninism, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, communes, state-run economy, etc. Second was going to be righting the wrongs of the century of humiliation. And third was going to be national unity. A national unity that would then bring about economic growth and the like. And in 1949, that was a very, very heady set of promises. And within this, today, fast forwarding 70 years, what we see is the concept of comprehensive national power as a key element of how the Chinese look at the overall situation. What is comprehensive national power? It's basically how China and other countries are racked and stacked. How do you assess whether China is more or less powerful than France, than the United States, than Brazil, than India, than Japan? It is not just military power. The Chinese are very good students of other people's history as well as their own. And they saw what happened to the Soviet Union. How many folks here are fans of Game of Thrones? Okay. So the Soviet Union was Tyrion with the mountain sword. And for those of you who are not Game of Thrones fans, Tyrion is a little person, literally, and the mountain is about 8 feet tall. So as you can imagine, he's not going to wield an 8-foot tall sword very well. The Chinese saw what happened in the Soviet Union, that excessive military spending could lead to economic collapse. So another piece of comprehensive national power is, of course, therefore, economic capability. But that, too, alone is not enough. Look at Japan. Japan had the inside track on being the next major power, the next superpower in the 1980s, and then sort of frittered it away. So what else does comprehensive national power entail? It entails political unity. You cannot move forward, you cannot progress, you cannot grow comprehensive national power if you are not unified. And unity here has multiple meanings. There is the literal physical unity. This is why Taiwan is an issue. This is why Tibet and Xinjiang cannot be allowed to go independent. But there's also political unity in the sense of being politically unified. And here we see the Chinese Communist Party in its ultimate Leninist sense. It is a vanguard party. It is the sole source of political authority within China. We have diplomatic recognition. Do other countries care what you think? During the century of humiliation, it was very clear the Qing court was almost irrelevant when it came to dealing with Britain and France and the United States. Today, China is a member of the UN Security Council, permanent member, wields a veto, member of the G20. Countries want to know what China thinks and often do not want to offend it. Science and technology. It's not enough to make other people's t-shirts and washing machines and computers and microchips. You want to be able to map your own destiny, and that means having an advanced S&T capability, whether that means your own space program, an advanced oceanographic research community, whether it is genomics, etc. And finally, cultural security. And this is something that as Americans, we sort of take for granted. But for the Chinese, this is a very, very real challenge. How many folks here have seen any of the Transformers movies? Or if you haven't, how many of you have taken your children or grandchildren to see the Transformers? Okay. For those of you, again, who haven't seen the Transformers movies, robots, aliens, they live among us. Turns out Harry Reid actually was right. But they hide themselves, they disguise themselves. But what do they disguise themselves as? As vehicles. But consider whose vehicles. If you've seen enough of the movies, and I've seen all of them, I have to admit, they hide themselves as Camaros, as International Harvester trucks, as F-22s, as M1 Abrams. You know what they don't hide themselves as? They don't hide themselves as Leopard 2 tanks, or J-20 fighters, or Sovremeny-class destroyers, or Fiats, or Ladas. So if you're an 8-year-old saving up your money to go see the latest Michael Bay Transformer extravaganza, whether you're in Bolivia, or Botswana, or Beijing, what are you implicitly accepting? That if aliens want to hide themselves as the most badass thing out there, they will pick an American model, not a Chinese model. That is a piece of cultural security that is hard to quantify and hard to describe as a tangible element, but is every bit as influential as the fact that you can go around the world and eat at a McDonald's, buy a pair of Levi's blue jeans, and drink Coca-Cola everywhere. So from the Chinese perspective, comprehensive national power-wise, this is a very important part of it. What all of this ties together, especially in this day and age, is information. And this goes to the heart of the evolving context of both comprehensive national power and warfighting and how the Chinese think about information. As I said earlier, the CCP is a Marxist-Leninist party. It is Leninist in the sense that it is a vanguard party. It is Marxist, not so much in the idea of from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. That would be rather hard to sustain in a nation which has hundreds of billionaires and thousands of millionaires, all of whom, by the way, or almost all of them, are members of the Chinese Communist Party. What I mean by Marxist here is that they recognize that there is a fundamental linkage between the nature of socioeconomic power and modern warfare and comprehensive national power writ large. That the nature of economies affects natures of society, which in turn affects the nature of future warfare. And so in the transition from the industrial age, which began roughly at the beginning of the 20th century, to the information age, which roughly begins at this end of the 20th century, we see a shift in what matters. So economically, we see that the growth of information technology and information access. Before, it was how many factories, how many tons of steel were you producing, and how much iron ore were you smelting. Today, it's how much information can you gather, how quickly can you transmit it. And that, in turn, influences military power and how you should assess it. So before we go a little further into the military side of things, there's a couple of aspects that I think it is very important to emphasize. And I would consider this hopefully one of the key takeaways that you will take with you after this presentation. The first is that the People's Liberation Army is a party army. It is not a national military. Every officer in the PLA above the rank of second lieutenant is a member of the party. You cannot rise, you cannot get promoted unless you are a member of the party. And that has distinct implications. To begin with, it is perfectly reasonable, as with the oath of every PLA officer, that you will support and maintain the rule of the CCP. And second of all, is that this puts a very different spin onto the idea of civil-military relations. And I would suggest to you that in China, it isn't so much civil versus military as it is almost like core samples. Civil and military within faction A, civil and military within faction B, civil and military within faction C. It also really raises questions about those who argue that the PLA operates independently as a rogue military. You heard a lot of this during the 2007 ASAT test. How is it that when people went to protest at the Australian embassy, by protest I mean formal diplomatic demarches, how is it that the ambassador to Australia or even the United States wasn't aware of the ASAT test? It must mean that the PLA fired it off on their own, right? No. The reason the foreign ministry didn't know is because the foreign ministry doesn't matter. Because what matters in China is party, not state. And the Chinese foreign minister hasn't been a member of the Politburo, the highest part of the party, since 1999. That, by the way, just changed with the 19th Party Congress a couple of weeks ago. So you would no more inform the foreign minister of an impending ASAT test than in the United States you would inform the Secretary of the Interior of an Aegis test. I don't think that the US Navy has suddenly become a rogue military because the Secretary of the Interior hasn't been informed that the Vela Gulf is about to shoot down something. And yet that's the kind of interpretation you have heard about the 2007 ASAT test. The other aspect here is that this is not your father's PLA. This is no longer a military that believes in quantity over quality, or that you will run out of bullets before they run out of bodies. They have been very close observers of other people's wars, in particular America's, because frankly we've fought a lot of them. And they are very, very assiduous, not only in their study, but their analysis and incorporating the lessons that they've learned into reforming their own military. And we'll come back to that at the end of this presentation. But first, we have the evolution of PLA thinking with regards to this not being your father's PLA. Because this is not something that just began under Xi Jinping. This has been ongoing since the first Gulf War. Under Jiang Zemin, who became General Secretary in 1992, but was part of the Politburo Standing Committee even before then, we saw the Chinese military engage in what is called the two modernizations. Meaning you were going to prepare the military no longer for local wars under modern conditions, heavy industrialized warfare, well suited to the industrial age, lots of tanks, lots of planes, lots of ships, didn't have to be highest quality, didn't even have to be all that modern, you were just going to have a lot of it, to local wars under modern high-tech conditions. And this was derived as a lesson specifically from the first Gulf War. The realization that future wars were going to be decided based on the so-called three nons. That future wars would be non-contact, you were going to engage the enemy beyond visual range. They would be non-linear, you didn't have nice sequenced defensive phase and then offensive phase. Instead, they would be all melded together. The front lines would be melded together. Strikes would be against forward and rear areas. And finally, non-symmetric. It's always interesting that we think of the Chinese as engaging in asymmetric warfare. But put yourselves in the shoes of the Chinese. Okay? First Gulf War, roughly about 40 days of aerial bombardment and the 100-hour ground campaign. You, the PLA, are now responsible for being able to defend against that kind of a war. Okay. Fast forward to the Balkan conflict. No ground operations, just an aerial bombardment. And yet Slobodan Milosevic winds up sitting in The Hague for crimes against humanity. You, the PLA, be prepared to fight against that kind of war. Fast forward to Afghanistan. Air power, precision munitions, special operations forces, plus local elements, the Northern Alliance, topples the Taliban in a remarkably short period. You, the PLA, be prepared to fight that kind of war. First, the second Gulf War, the war against Iraq. 1.5 divisions rolling up a single road from Kuwait to Baghdad over multiple rivers and bridges. Anybody here seen a bridge too far? Right? Except the Americans and their British allies pull it off. You, the PLA, be prepared to fight that kind of war. In the course of 15 years, the Western allies engage in 4 large conflicts completely differently each time. How does the PLA think the next war might shape up? What they do recognize is the importance of quantity over quality, that a quantity-based army was not going to be able to be that flexible and capable. Hu Jintao in 2004 issues the so-called new historic missions to the PLA. You've already had 10 years or so of double-digit budget increases year on year. You're expecting to get more, but this is what you have to be able to do with that. It is a guidance to the PLA. First, keep the CCP in power. Again, perfectly reasonable, it's a party army. Second, be prepared to sustain the conditions for economic development. That comes in 2 parts. You can't allow Taiwan to go independent. That is always the first and foremost mission of the PLA. Back to political unity, as I said earlier. But also, you are not the foremost priority. This should be very sobering. China has a new aircraft carrier. China has 2 stealth fighter programs. China has new tanks. China has new airborne early warning capabilities, ASATs. China is working on a space station. China has maritime support vessels, underway replenishment ships, serial production of multiple surface combatants. The PLA is not the highest priority for China. Think about what a mobilized Chinese economy could produce. That was part of Hu Jintao's directive that has been echoed by Xi Jinping. You are not going to be the foremost priority for national economic development. Third, maintain your ability to dominate key domains. And those key domains are the maritime, space, and cyber domains. And that's why we see such prioritized spending within these areas. So, as I said earlier, as the PLA has been studying other people's wars, in part because it hasn't fought one since 1979, and as it recognizes that we now live in the information age, their assessment and the reason for the evolution from local wars under high-tech conditions to local wars under informationized conditions was the realization that not all technology is created equal. Not all high tech is equally important. The most important is that which has to do with information. And that is because both economies and warfare is now informatized, or informationized, or informationalized, or informationalizationized. Okay. You see every one of these variations, but the Chinese is always the same, 信息化. And the point is that information is now applied to all aspects. An informationized economy, all aspects of the economy. An informationized warfare, all aspects. Training, recruitment, logistics, supply, command and control, weapons guidance. So at the strategic level, we should be thinking about the use of information as a strategic tool. So here we see the Chinese talk about using information to deny legitimacy and to reframe how things are perceived. It is about altering the context. One of the key tools here is political warfare. So the Chinese talk about political warfare, they inevitably talk about the so-called 3 warfares. The first of the 3 warfares is public opinion warfare. And this is a standalone campaign. We are at war with China, and China is at war with us. In their perception, we are already in conflict. Now, no, that doesn't mean that we should be looking for bomb shelters, obviously. But we and they are engaged in a struggle to influence globally public perceptions. Who is the good guy, who is the bad guy? For the Chinese, this is fundamental. If they can win the public opinion war, then the countries may not invite the United States even to enter their region. An American carrier group that is asked not to deploy into the South China Sea or not into the Yellow Sea is every bit as out of action as a carrier that is sitting on the bottom of the Marianas Trench. In fact, it's better because you haven't killed 5,000 American sailors. You haven't created a Pearl Harbor rally around the flag moment. You've created dissent between the US and its allies. public opinion warfare. Psychological warfare, the erosion of your adversary's morale. The Chinese, this is a trademarked phrase, I've trademarked it, have engaged in weaponized tourism. We saw this in the Philippines, we've seen this in Taiwan, we see this ongoing in South Korea. The Chinese are very unhappy that the South Koreans have deployed THAAD, and one of the things that they have done with the millions of tourists who visit South Korea is that they have formed their own travel agents, stop booking tours to South Korea. Send them to Thailand, send them to Malaysia, send them to France. Discourage people from going to South Korea. And so we've seen hundreds of tour groups pull the plug, often at the last minute, which of course affects a hotel that expected to have 80% occupancy, thanks to these large tourist groups, all of a sudden with lots of empty beds. And it's not just the hotel owners, right? It's restaurateurs, it's taxi cab drivers, it's tour guides, it's souvenir hawkers. The Chinese are very upfront about this. They say in broadcasts, in news commentary, in opinion pieces, you live in a democracy. You're very proud of that, by the way. You can influence your government. Tell your government not to deploy THAAD. Because we have no argument with you. We have an argument with your government deploying THAAD. So far, the South Koreans seem to have held the line, at least on THAAD, but we watched President Moon talking about the new 3 no's for South Korea, what they won't do with the United States in order to mollify China. We saw this with the Philippines over the Philippine claims to the South China Sea, which in the Chinese view are illegitimate. We've seen this with Taiwan. So this is psychological warfare because it is a reminder. We're the number 2 economy in the world. What number are you? How dependent are you on us? Don't make me angry, Mr. Kim, Mr. Duterte, Mr. Rodrigo. You won't like me if I'm angry. So, and finally, legal warfare, calling into question the fundamental legal basis for various elements. And we see this, for example, again, in the South China Sea, because as the Chinese themselves know, legal warfare is not just about international law and treaties. It's about domestic law. It's about regulations. It is also about things like law enforcement agencies. So China uses its Coast Guard to assert its claims in places like the South China Sea. Why? In part because it's less escalatory. The Americans deploy their Navy. We deploy White Hulls, Coast Guard ships. But also because it's a reminder, this is Chinese territory. China doesn't have to deploy its military to patrol its territory any more than the United States would think about sending a squadron of F-16s over downtown Chicago. Although you might actually think about doing that with the murder rate there these days. So from the Chinese perspective, this is an implicit message. The South China Sea is Chinese. We don't have to deploy our Navy to defend it. We'll deploy our Coast Guard. You deploy your Navy because you're intruding. So informationized warfare, then, should be seen as a form of strategic anti-access area denial. It is the hardest form of soft power. If they're successful, they delay or disrupt intervention. And if they are successful, you have influenced 3 key audiences. Your domestic audience, you always keep an eye on, do you have popular support? The fate of Slobodan Milosevic is a very telling one. Your adversaries, population and leadership, and third parties. You don't want them supporting the United States. You don't want them participating in embargoes. You don't want them voting on their side at the UN. So at the strategic level, information is being used as a means of altering the context. At the operational level, we have information warfare. And that is more the use of information in the actual conduct of military operations. And the goal here is to obtain information dominance. Information dominance is basically the ability to gather, transmit, and exploit information faster and more accurately than your adversary, and to deny them the same. Information warfare includes several broad aspects. One is network warfare. Network warfare is more than just cyber. It is the ability to impact all networks, Communications networks, yes. Air traffic control networks, energy networks, transportation networks, and electronic warfare. And the Chinese were the first to come up with the concept of integrated network and electronic warfare. Remember that. They came up with that long before we did. Yes, China can be innovative. Broadly speaking, the Chinese seem to think of network warfare as about the software and electronic warfare as about the hardware. So you jam the radars, which obviously does have some software aspects to it, but you would then potentially open the way for insertion of viruses and the like. And again, psychological warfare. But here, this is at the operational level. So now we're talking about how do I affect military commanders and military plans and military staffs and military activities. So for example, how many emails would have to be corrupted? How many Transcom loads are misdirected to Mildenhall or to Mountain Home rather than, say, Osan or Manila before you would conclude that you can no longer trust your electronic information systems? Okay, well, you could always send runners. You could always print stuff out in hard copy and transmit it, right? Now here's the question, have you trained for that? The Navy stopped training people in shooting the sun with sextants and the like for many years because we knew we'd have GPS. Now we're reintroducing all of that into the midshipman's career paths, education paths. But here's the question. Do we really think we can operate a carrier group, including air operations, including application of munitions, if the GPS system isn't working? Sure, you've trained to shoot the sun, you can figure out where you are. But how well do you think you can get all of those aircraft in time on target? How much have you trained for that? The Chinese aren't saying, oh, then you'll back off and you'll surrender. What they are saying is, you're going to be much more leery about engaging because your casualties will probably be higher. It's a psychological effect as much as it is a physical effect. Just as the Chinese concluded that not all technology is created equal, and in fact that it's the information technologies that are most important, now we see in their writings an apparent concentration that not all networks, not all electronics, not all leader psychologies are equal. That in fact, the most important are those associated with intelligence and command and control. And that's really in many ways not that surprising, right? Because what you're talking about is the key people who make decisions and the key people who inform those decisions. So again, the objective here is to achieve information dominance. And that includes degrading your adversaries, command and control, information processing, and psychology. And that has implications at the tactical level of information operations. Because in addition to electronic warfare, psychological warfare, et cetera, at the tactical level, we have physical destruction. Just as the Chinese talked about integrated network and electronic warfare, they have also emphasized integrated network firepower warfare. Because sometimes the best way to make sure that the communication system is down is to blow away the talk completely. Sometimes you jam it, sometimes you spoof it. And the Chinese believe in integrating the firepower aspect, for example, or physical destruction, which may not involve firepower. Maybe it means cutting submarine cables, forcing you up onto satellites, which are then lower bandwidth and potentially vulnerable to other attacks. Cyber operations then are actually a relatively small part of this portfolio of capabilities. There does not, in fact, seem to be a standalone element for cyber. The Chinese don't talk about cyber dominance or cyber deterrence. They talk about information dominance and information deterrence. So information operations include cyber, but it includes all of the various things you're doing, including deception and denial, in order to try and alter your adversary's acceptance of information. And it must begin in peacetime. You cannot map the networks. You can't map the decision-making processes in real time in time of crisis in wartime. You have to start in peacetime. And here, things like the OPM hack become a key aspect, right? Figuring out who works for the government. Now, by itself, that's already pretty powerful. But hacking Ashley Madison, that's genius. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ashley Madison. That's the online dating service for those of you who are already married. So it probably doesn't take too much to figure out that if you're in the OPM system and on the Ashley Madison database, you might be targetable as a human intelligence source, right? But let's consider some of the other things. Your credit rating. We think the Chinese hacked Target, among other credit card companies, Equifax. Maybe you have some monetary issues. What are the 4 pieces of suborning people? Money, ideology, compromise, and ego. We've got ego, we've got compromise. So ideology, maybe, maybe not. Certainly money, right? Or perhaps it's your health. Anthem Healthcare's databases have also been hacked. So these are all aspects of the employment of information at the tactical level that could have strategic impact. Now the Chinese, as I said earlier, believe in offense and defense. So they're not just talking about how they can attack other people. They also are focused on defending themselves. So they break defense into 4 broad pieces. There's hardware security. Are the servers and the routers physically secure? Maybe that means putting them in bunkers. Maybe that means redundancy. Maybe that means resilience. Software security. Here the Chinese have some interesting problems. A lot of their computers are running Microsoft. A lot of their computers are running Microsoft XP. A lot of their computers are running counterfeit copies of Microsoft XP, which means that there are 0-day vulnerabilities that were patched years ago if you paid through the nose for your licensed copy of Microsoft XP, but which might not actually have gotten the pushed out updates from Redmond Central. You have data security, and the Chinese see this as separate from the issue of software security. If you think about space systems, you have the TT&C tracking, telemetry, and control systems that govern the satellite, and then you have the data that the satellites are collecting or transmitting, passing over it. Those are 2 different pieces. And finally, management security, which is really about, again, the human element. Have you been taught not to insert a USB you find into your computer? Do you actually insert a USB you found into your computer anyway? And we may think that's funny, but up at West Point, for example, a few years back, they talked to the cadets, and obviously they are a motivated bunch. Don't do this. And then they scattered around 20 USBs around campus. And if you stuck it into your computer, your screen went blank and then it said, report to the commandant's office. And apparently something like 15 cadets and 5 professors wound up in the commandant's office. Now, that's for West Pointers. That's for folks who are motivated. These are people who are living and breathing and sleeping national security. Now think about what that might mean for contractors, for government civilians, for non-government civilians, for people who work at OPM or Anthem or Target, right? So, okay, all this is all well and good. He's been droning on for God knows how long at this point. Is any of this for real? PLA reforms. December 31st, 2015, the PLA underwent the most massive set of reforms since its foundation. Broadly speaking, we can see this cut into 3 tranches. They reformed the Central Military Commission, which manages the entire PLA. By the way, the Chinese Ministry of Defense does not run China's military. The Ministry of Defense is a protocol entity because somebody has to meet the Secretary of Defense, the Minister of Defense, the Chief of Defense at the airport. And somebody is in charge of the military attachés who are posted abroad. But that person does not run China's military. That is done through the Central Military Commission, in particular the 2 vice chairmen of the CMC, who are the most senior uniformed officers. We saw the reorganization of the Central Military Commission to include the creation of a joint staff department. Why does joint matter? Because the PLA is planning on fighting the next war in a joint manner, which means information sharing, mutual situational awareness. information. We saw the creation of 3 new services, the most important of which, relative to this presentation, is the PLA Strategic Support Force, which brought together China's electronic warfare forces, network warfare forces, space warfare forces, and oh, by the way, some of their political warfare forces. This is much more reasonably termed the PLA Information Warfare Force. This is a new service, right? And finally, it went from 7 military regions to 5 war zones. The war zones are permanent. The old military regions were peacetime establishments. They knew that they would change in wartime. The war zones are standing wartime entities, and their headquarters are joint, which was not the case with the military regions. The Southern War Zone, for example, has a Navy commander. That's never happened with any of the military regions. They were always ground force commanders. East, South, West, and North, and Center. So what does the Center War Zone control? Center War Zone, we're not actually sure yet. A lot of folks believe that the Central War Zone is in charge of the National Strategic Reserve, will allocate resources for combating internal security threats. I think that's a very reasonable guess. But I would submit that it is also possible that the Central War Zone may have a functional rather than geographic set of responsibilities. If that's true, it may have control over information warfare forces, because the cyber world and the space world are globe spanning, and the nuclear forces because of nuclear reach. Are there any questions?
Okay, hang on one second. Bunch of rules on questions. For those who have heard me before, I apologize. Please do wait for the microphone because we are recording this event and we want everybody to, not only in the room to hear your question, but people online to hear your question. Please do tell us who you are, so tell us your name and affiliation and try to avoid acronyms that nobody knows what they are. We do have a lot of people here tonight, so we would ask that you only ask one question. We know that everybody likes to put their question in context, but we would ask that you keep it really short and actually do ask a question. And then finally, your question should relate to tonight's topic.
Thank you. I'm Tom Barnett with Institute for Defense Analyses and a former naval person. So the South China Sea and the ruling against the Chinese claims, the 9-dash line or 13-dash line, whatever dash the Chinese are touting these days, was a very legalistic slam dunk ruling against them that they've protested mightily against. So could you comment on how they view legal regimes of conduct amongst nations who are on the periphery of the center, and whether there's a basis for following up in that area, or whether this is, forget it, it's theirs, we stay out, or we go only there under their deference. Thank you.
What ruling is this? Sorry, I think that's the Chinese reaction. You mentioned some ruling as though it's relevant. How charming. No, the Chinese attitude, in fact, was literally that. I'm being only slightly sarcastic. The Chinese were actually much more obnoxious. Cui Tiankai, now the ambassador to the United States, actually said that the Permanent Court of Arbitration was unqualified. Unqualified. These are some of the best jurists in the world, was unqualified to pass judgment. Other Chinese foreign ministry officials who, in this context, sort of matter because they are speaking on behalf of the party as well as the state, basically said, this is like mosquitoes. I mean, this is irrelevant. So this is a huge problem because we have this idea that China is going to somehow be a proponent for globalization, proponent for global rules, a rules-based order, and China benefits from it. Not really. China is more than happy to abide by any rule that it basically can't break without consequences. But there haven't been consequences. China lost the PCA rule, Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling. It therefore got something like 4 démarches. I don't know of any contracts that were broken or canceled. I don't know of any ambassadors who were recalled. I don't know of any ambassadors who were ejected. I don't know of a single conference or meeting where the Chinese were disinvited. Now, this occurred at about the time that the United States took 4 years off, 3.5 years off, from even doing FONOPs around the Spratlys. I mean, you really can't codify Chinese claims much better than by not challenging them. And that, in my opinion, was a terrible, terrible mistake. So, what does that mean for the future? Well, I'm about to say something positive about Donald Trump. Let me note here. 1, yes, I work for the Heritage Foundation. The reason you don't see the tail and the pitchfork is because the security folks took it from me when I came in. Second of all, I don't particularly care for Mr. Trump. I don't oppose him. He's not my problem. I focus on China. But what I will note here is that since January 20th of this year, the United States has conducted 4 FONOPs in the Spratly Islands area. We have now conducted as many FONOPs in 11 months as we did for 4 years from 2012 to 2016. That is one way of challenging China's claims to the South China Sea and in particularly around the Spratlys. So, do we have to concede it to them? No. But we must recognize that at this point, a good chunk of the Mustangs have run out of the barn and are thundering over the hills. There are air bases now, airstrips on those islands. There are hardened aircraft shelters on those islands. There are facilities for SAMs on those islands. There are underground facilities. We've watched them building them and covering them on those islands. So reversing course, if you have to do it by force, and no, I'm not recommending that, will be bloody. Bloodier than if we had said back in 2012, stop, or we're going to cut off trade, or you're not going to list on the New York Stock Exchange, or we're not going to allow our companies to set up research campuses in your country. Your choice. We didn't do any of those things. Okay. Now we may have to pay that piper. But no, it is absolutely worth challenging. It is absolutely worth imposing a cost. Not because, this is a little bit like Napoleon at Marengo, who rides up to his aides and says, after whipping out his watch, this battle is lost, but we still have time to win another this day. Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, that may be lost. But maybe we can tell the Chinese not to build at Scarborough Shoal and make it serious. Maybe we can impose a cost before they engage in their next bit of grignotage. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir. Always edifying to hear you speak. Sergeant Edon from the Marine Corps Information Operations Center. Question I have is when they're doing this narrative formation, with the implementation and the execution of it, how centralized is it? Specifically with regards to 3 narratives. One we see in the Spratlys, one we see against the Uyghurs, and then one recently where the vice chairman of the CMC who recently committed suicide. Are these all the same entities? And then also, finally, the education process for teaching the individuals who are responsible for this narrative formation, development, and execution, do they share a common educational source?
On the first question of is the narrative centralized, at least in their doctrinal writings, the answer is yes. They emphasize that this has to be centralized. It has to be a consistent, reinforcing set of messages. And I would submit that if you think about Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign behind D-Day, it was centralized. So where Bomber Harris sent RAF bombers at night was coordinated with where 8th Air Force bombed during the day, and we bombed the Pas de Calais twice for every mission over Normandy, which was tied in turn to the deception missions, which was in turn tied to the radio transmission messages, which was in turn tied to where Patton would go on public tours. All of that was centralized. It was orchestrated. So I would suggest that at least some of these messages are orchestrated. So for example, with regards to the Uyghurs and the South China Sea, is it specifically, look, we have Uyghurs in the South China Sea? No, obviously not. But what we do have is China will defend its territory, whether it is in the northwest and Xinjiang or the southeast in the South China Sea, or whether it is the Taiwans. As for the suicide of Xu Chaihu, that I suspect is part of a different message, which is you in the military have to understand that you are every bit as much under the party's control. And more importantly, you in the military who may oppose Xi Jinping may want to get your head screwed on straight. Because otherwise, it may have Excedrin headache 7.65. So that is, I think, part of a different message. Now, how you separate out those messages and are they all going out to the same people and from the same places, that gets very complicated. It is unfortunate that we have a limited cadre of people who look at these sorts of issues. Just very quickly, with regards to educational sources, possibly this goes to the small cadre of people. That's a great question. In my personal opinion, yes, I think there are probably places. In particular, the political work department, which is responsible for political warfare, has its own colleges, and that is almost certainly one of the educational pathways through. But writ large, that's a great question. I hope somebody will encourage their grad students to write dissertations on this subject.
Thank you. I'm Ben Richter from Booz Allen. Right on China's border is a little problem called North Korea. I was wondering if you would comment on how you see the Chinese view of the North Koreans and their leader, their nuclear and missile programs, and how you think they might act in the future to thwart those programs or to exploit them. Thank you.
Thank you for asking that question, because Duncan had asked me to address that and I did not fit that into the slide deck. So broadly speaking, how does China view North Korea? So for years, decades really, the Chinese and North Koreans kept using the same phrase, that we are as close as lips and teeth. That might have been true in 1953. Today, I would suggest that they are as close as lips and the cup of really gross water containing your grandmother's dentures that's sitting on her nightstand. That is how close they are. North Korea is beyond a problem child for the Chinese. Okay. Deng Xiaoping took Kim Il-sung, grandfather of the current leader, to Shanghai and Beijing in the late 1980s and said, look, this is how much more developed you could become if you would loosen the grip a bit. And reportedly, Kim Il-sung looked around, nodded, and said, whatever happened to your communists? Which was not a nice thing to say to Deng Xiaoping, head of the Chinese Communist Party. So we have a North Korea that has undergone dynastic succession twice, something that no Marxist-Leninist would support, and frankly, the Chinese weren't real happy. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is, beginning with Kim Il-sung, he exterminated, and I use that word very deliberately, all opposition in his country to him and the succession to Kim Jong-il. So that meant liquidating the pro-Chinese communists in North Korea and the pro-Soviet communists in North Korea, and then spending almost 30 years playing the two sides off against each other, which is why North Korea never really fell into the orbit of either China or the Soviet Union. And let's be honest here, folks, that's pretty darn impressive. North Korea parlayed a pair of fours into a pretty winning hand repeatedly against two larger, much better endowed players, to continue this somewhat drawn-out poker analogy. Kim Jong-il sustained that. and survived the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism globally. Again, if you take away the ideological aspect and the fact that these are reprehensible people, that's impressive poker playing. Kim Jong-un, unfortunately for him, did not enjoy that same period of preparation, right? His older brother, the guy who got assassinated in Malaysia, was supposed to be the successor to Kim Jong-il. Why didn't he succeed? Because he was dumb. Because he got caught at Narita Airport in Japan with a Guatemalan passport and a very bad likeness. And when they asked him, why are you trying to sneak into Japan? His answer was, and I'm not kidding here, I wanted to go to Disney World. No, seriously, he wanted to go to Tokyo Disney World. And the Japanese were like, that's nice, we're putting you on the next plane back out of here. So that was sufficiently embarrassing that dad, Kim Jong-il, middle leader, actually then said, okay, you are too much of a screw up, you're out of here. The problem was that he had already spent multiple years laying the groundwork for Kim Jong-nam to take over. So now he has, who can he choose? Well, he's got a middle son. We're not really sure what the deal is with him. It is possible that he is developmentally challenged. It is possible that he simply doesn't fit the profile of being a great leader. So he picked Kim Jong-un, his youngest son, to then be the designated successor. But Kim Jong-il was already very sick. So he died after about 3 years. Sorry, Kim Jong-un took over after Kim Jong-il only had about 3 years to lay the groundwork. So Kim Jong-un has been very uneasy in a sense. And we think that's one of the reasons why he did things like execute his uncle by putting him in front of an anti-aircraft cannon and blowing him away. And why he's been executing a lot of very senior leaders. So, what does all this have to do with China and nuclear weapons? North Korea is independent. North Korea is not an outgrowth of China. China does not have the influence we'd like to think it has. Why not? Because North Korea is also on the edge. Okay? Its economy has improved, but only marginally. At the end of the day, China has one big hammer, which is we can cut off oil and food to you. If we cut off oil and food to you, we can probably topple your government. Then what? Do we, China, want to see Korea reunified? Do we want a possible game of what happened to the nuclear weapons? Do we want several million refugees crossing into China? If there's one thing China doesn't particularly want right now, it's more people. So in this context then, North Korea is a pain in the neck, but it is a known pain in the neck. And one of the interesting things, when you look at that night photograph of Northeast Asia, right? Lit up China, lit up Japan, lit up South Korea, and one little dot of light in North Korea. That is testimony to how limited Chinese support is. How hard would it be for China to link North Korea into its power grid? Not that hard. How hard would it be for China to export some additional fuel oil to run more power plants? They don't. North Korea is dark because China is choosing to allow North Korea to be dark. In part because a weak North Korea is one that probably won't invade South Korea. It's not like they haven't tried before, right? So the problem is Russia. This is where things get really fun and interesting. Because Russia has been exporting oil to North Korea, sending food aid to North Korea, and actually even opened up a second fiber optic link to North Korea, a country where we think there's a few thousand computer people and only about a dozen cat videos. So it's not like they need the internet. So why open up a second link? Well, it's a great way to spread viruses like the WannaCry virus, which the US government today actually has said we think was put out by North Korea. Why is this a problem for China? Because North Korea has played China and Russia off for 60 years. And we see this again now. If China sides with the United States and increases pressure on North Korea, who doesn't like the Chinese either, they understand how basically they are exploited by the Chinese, well, has Russia. China does not want to push North Korea into Russian hands. If China competes with Russia, then in that case, China angers the United States. Donald Trump is going to think that you are not doing bigly when it comes to dealing with North Korea. From Mr. Putin's perspective, this is perfect. He gets to parlay a pair of threes into a winning hand. So all of which adds up to no one's really got a good handle on how to stop the North Koreans. A lot of players are in it for their own interests, which may even involve improving North Korea's position. And at the end of the day, Kim Jong-un remains committed to the great, glorious objective laid out by his father and his grandfather, which is the unification of the Korean Peninsula under North Korean rule. Now, you may say that's a fantasy. And I would tend to agree with you from an objective analytical perspective. But I'm not the one that needs to be deterred. Kim Jong-un is. And I don't think we have a very good sense of what deters Kim Jong-un.
Good evening. I'm Gary Williams from Lockheed Martin. I'd like to know your perspective on what you believe China's strategic intent is ultimately with some of their expansionism. Is it to have an extended global reach similar to the United States, or is it more to form a buffer around their borders and just be more regionally focused?
Neither. What I would say the Chinese strategic goal is, and at this point, let's be honest, this is prognostication, right? Is like a Mariushka doll. So first we have China's immediate environs, what traditionally has always been in the Chinese sphere of influence. Whether it is Korea, whether it is Taiwan, whether it is, well, Taiwan's part of China, the Philippines, continental Southeast Asia, these clearly need to know their place, and their place is firmly in China's orbit. The next layer goes out to the second island chain to the east, India, Central Asia. There you have the One Belt, One Road. It is to tie these regions to China economically, creating markets, creating places that perhaps China can move dirtier industries out there, which is a nice way of meeting your COP21 requirements. So have somebody else do the polluting. But also to make sure that those regions understand that it's really not in their interest to try and balance China with a fickle United States or anybody else. And then you have the Africa and Europe and South America, which is nice trading partners. Happy to do trading with you, happy to export to you goods and import various materials. By the way, long term is even better. I'm more than happy to sign market rates with you, but I would like a 5 or 10 year guarantee. And I'm willing to pay for that. And I'm willing to help build the infrastructure that will ensure that. So no, I don't think, despite game designer fantasies of things like home front, I don't think the Chinese expect to have troops patrolling the south side of Chicago or St. Louis or anything like that. Much, much better to have that done by Americans, which is to say, create interest groups in various countries that see it in their interest to sell goods to China, to have stability. In this regard, it's very different from the Russian model. The Russians are in a hurry, and they have a lot fewer resources. The Chinese are taking a longer perspective and are willing to spend a lot of resources to very slowly alter the terms. So a Confucius Institute is not going to change anybody's mind tomorrow. But 10 years of injecting $200,000 into your university's budget as free money might start impacting how often you sponsor research into Uyghurs or invite Tibetan activists who you don't like anyway, to come and speak on campus, or sign letters condemning Chinese human rights practices, and might even affect course selection and offerings. And those students will become congressional staffers and military officers and lobbyists and all of the rest. So I think that the Chinese, again, if it's Chinese territory in their view, Taiwan, South China Sea, Tibet, Xinjiang, that's one thing. I don't see them declaring Kyrgyzstan as the 35th province or something like that. Now, the One Belt, One Road aspect is a very interesting piece of economic, but also diplomatic power. It is a piece of technological power. In the 2016 Space White Paper, they talk about One Belt, One Road. And they talk about how we want this infrastructure that we are going to build to rely on the Beidou system. Not simply for the surveys to figure out where is the pipeline going to go, but the timing aspect, right? Think about it. 5,000 miles of pipeline. How do you pump oil through a 5,000-mile pipeline without creating back pressure waves? You're going to have to time all of those pumping stations. Now, you could use GPS, but I'm paying for this. So you're probably going to use Beidou. Well, once you've used Beidou, it's going to be very expensive for you to switch to GPS. So in the longer term, has China created a captive market for its timing and its products and its procedures and its training as it invests all the way from Korla and Ulaanbaatar to Piraeus and Tallinn?
So, sir, Bill Conley, I'm the Deputy Director for Electronic Warfare in the Pentagon across the street. One of the, I'll say, advantages perhaps China has with the one-party system is it allows them to have unity of effort over multiple administrations and therefore lay out much longer plans. And so in reading Cyber Dragon, a phenomenal look at where things are today, what do you think the next 25 years brings or will result in?
By the way, Cyber Dragon is a fine volume produced by an author who is in this room, and it's available from finer booksellers everywhere. 25 years. Hard to say. But what I would note here is a couple of things. 25 years is a good example. One, the Chinese absolutely have this advantage of consistency and constancy. They also have it because they plan and budget in 5-year plans. So what we already see is the Chinese saying that by 2020, they expect the first phase of modernization to be completed. What is that likely to mean? The PLASSF, new service, what exactly are the lines of responsibility? Who exactly reports to whom? I think that we will see that hammered out. We will probably see new doctrine taking shape in the 2021 to 2025 timeframe as they take these new services, new organizational entities, and basically try to say, all right, now that we've got the organization down, how can we exploit this? What weaknesses will we identify between now and 2020? What tweaks and modifications will we need? I think what we should expect to see in the longer term with regards to overall information efforts is, so long as the Chinese economy continues to expand, and it still is, multiple pathways being pursued simultaneously. And here, one of the great problems is going to be us. There is pretty good evidence that the Chinese basically have gone through DARPA's records. And here I don't mean DARPA's classified records, I mean DARPA's unclassified records. And have basically said, you know, they came up with a lot of interesting ideas that they never funded. Or they funded to prototype and never put into production. Or in some cases, they had these really interesting ideas that in 1970 just couldn't happen. But it's not 1970 anymore. Let me flip this on its head a little bit. One of the things that actually, Duncan, I've talked to you a little bit about this before. Back in the 1970s, we had something called DASH, Drone Anti-Submarine Warfare Helicopter. It's going to be a little robotic helicopter, probably about the size of 5 of these desks. And we were going to put them on the back of Gearing Fram destroyers, Fram Fleet Rehabilitation and Modernization. And it didn't work very well. And Duncan Brown actually worked on those. He's got great stories about some of the problems that occurred with them. But the point here is, that's a drone. The software's gotten better. The positioning has gotten better. The communications has gotten better. Could you do a Dash helicopter today? Quite possibly. Could you make it even more effective if you fitted it out with advanced composites and all the rest? Probably. So how many programs that hit prototype, milestone 1, whatever, in 1968 or 71 or 53, well, 53 is early, and we said, nah, it's too hard, and are now matters of public record? It seems the Chinese are very efficient. Why pay for me to do the research when somebody else already has? So I would suggest that these are some of the things that we may well see pursued by the Chinese in the next 10 years. 25 years is a long time. The problem with that sort of time horizon is a lot of things could happen that are just out of nowhere. I don't know where the Chinese are going to be with quantum computing. I don't know where they're going to be with quantum communications. If half of that stuff holds out to be true, that could be very scary. If the Chinese do genetic engineering, that could be very scary. I will also throw out there, Plan 863, China's basic high technology research program. If you are a part of Plan 863, they pour a lot of money and a lot of research resources and institutes into it. Among the initial wave were aerospace, genetic engineering, advanced materials, energy, power storage, etc. In the 90s, they added oceanographics. We assume that we are king of the underwater world. And at the moment, I'm willing to say that maybe that's true. But 25 years from now, between improvements in computing, improvements in their manufacturing, improvements in their ability to maintain surveillance over the South China Sea, where they openly write, this is not classified, this is from Chinese open source, admittedly in the Chinese language, but that's a separate issue. They are laying a massive SOSUS network, sonar surveillance system network, across the bottom of the South China Sea. I'm not really sure we should be confident that, shoot, I'm going to sail 3, 5, 8 Virginia-class, Columbia-class boats in there and nobody's going to find them. I'm going to do whatever I want to the Chinese Navy and land bases. Maybe. Maybe you're going to wind up with a lot of telegrams to sailors' families in Norfolk and Pearl Harbor and San Diego.
Tony Levine, Undersecretary of Defense at the Pentagon. Seems like President Xi Jinping has taken a page out of Putin's playbook and Erdogan of Turkey when it comes to bending the rules a little bit to stay in power. At the recent People's Congress, he really didn't set up a successor for him after he supposedly leaves. Do you think he's trying to stay in power?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd probably go up to Wall Street and make a lot more money. But what I would say is the following. Wang Qishan is Xi Jinping's right-hand man. He hit the age of 70, which is past the age of retirement. For the members of the Politburo/Politburo Standing Committee who are not the General Secretary Xi, or the number 2 guy, Li Keqiang. And there was speculation that, yeah, but Xi Jinping really depends on this guy. He is his hatchet man. He is the John Gotti for Xi Jinping, okay? I mean, he basically, goes and has people terminated because of corruption. So he's going to want Wang Qishan to stay on. Well, Wang Qishan didn't get to stay on. So point one is, I think the retirement age thing is for real. Now, Xi himself is not under a retirement age requirement because he's the general secretary of the party and it's good to be king. However, there does seem to be something of a tradition that you get 2 terms. Now, FDR broke that, but that's a separate issue. But what I would note here is the following. Of the 7 members of the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the ultimate power in China, the top of the party, we won't count Xi Jinping, obviously. We won't count Li Keqiang, number 2, he's also the premier for the state. Of the remaining 5 members, all of whom are new, 3 of them will not have to step down in 2022 at the time of the next party congress. So what I would suggest is that Xi Jinping, no, he didn't designate you are going to be my successor. That's true. But having 3 members of the Politburo Standing Committee who can stay on, and there's no precedent for forcing someone to step down, he may not have designated a specific successor, and there's a lot of reasons in an authoritarian system you don't want to say, you are going to take over from me. He has also made very clear that whoever comes up, he can influence, because he will have 3 people who owe their position and their longevity to him. So if I were to do, sort of placing bets, I'd probably put the odds on one of those three. But regardless of whether any of those three become a successor, whoever is a successor is going to have to curry favor with those three, because that's a pretty powerful block of votes right there who could block whoever rises up. So I think that Xi Jinping, in some ways, if he said, I think I might want a third term, and he hasn't ruled that out yet, but in my opinion, if he were to say, I want a third term, he could engender a lot of opposition, saying, no, 2 terms, I will step down, I will rule from behind the scenes, I will make sure my legacy is untrammeled, and by the way, you're going to have to get the approval of my 3 trusted proteges here who owe everything to me, works almost as well.
Matt Miller, Office of Secretary of Defense. As early as the 1970s, we've heard about the one-child policy in China, and recently that may have been relaxed a little bit, but assuming aggressive measures of population control are still in effect, only producing 1 offspring, mathematically that would lead to an aging population. Have you seen evidence of this, and also any threat to economic stability?
Yes, we have definitely seen evidence of the aging population aspect. We think at this point that the Chinese working age population has either stabilized or is already starting to decline because of that one-child policy, and as important, the giant child boom that preceded it. The 2-child policy is real, but as we have seen in country after country, just because you can have 2 children does not mean you wind up having 2 children. And because education in China has become very expensive, not the state paid for portion, but all the cram school, prepping for cram school, and cram school for the prepping school, you laugh, but one of the biggest bestsellers in China was How to Get Your Kid into Harvard. It has sold millions of copies because that is what Chinese parents do. That whole tiger mom thing that you may have read about? Trust me, it's real. I know. So, with regards to ultimate longer-term impact, we think already that China is one of the largest markets for robots as part of the how do we deal with an aging population and a shrinking workforce base. The PLA, we've seen some documents that talk about how are we going to handle this. Part of the shift to quality almost certainly is we can't afford massive casualties. The investment in robotics includes in the military. What we also do see, interestingly, is psychological profiling of their own recruits that says, a lot of these single kids, they're terrible. They're selfish, they're self-centered, they're spoiled, they're completely out of shape. No, because their parents and grandparents have spoiled them rotten. And so it's sort of amusing to see United States Marine Corps concerned about recruits, and then see almost the same articles appear about how Chinese military officers are worried about obesity, diabetes, lack of physical training and experience, et cetera. So, not the mirror image, it's not the same problem. We also see in China the fascinating challenges posed to doctors. If you are a doctor in an urban area, you are paid by the parents of draftees, because they do still have conscription, to declare the kids 4F. I do not want my child serving in the military. I want my kid to go off and work for Oracle or Alibaba or one of those companies. On the other hand, rural doctors get paid off to declare the kids 1A, because that's how you get out of West Podunkia, Sichuan province, learn a trade, get permission to live in the cities, have much better prospects, etc. all of this is then further complicated, this is a long answer, I apologize, by the very interesting cultural difference here. In the United States, serving in the military is not something a lot of people do, but it is certainly something that we honor, and that's to the good. There is an old Chinese saying, this is a real one, not a fortune cookie. You don't take good steel and make nails. You don't take good men and make soldiers. Serving in the military is not a preferred career path. Families, sort of military lineage families, Montgomery Meggs, the Lees, et cetera, Pattons, that's not particularly encouraged. They're trying to change that. Hotels, railway stations, movie theaters, they now have lines for military, right? You get preferential treatment. But that's very new. So you have an aging population, you have a shrinking 18 to 24-year-old base from which to draw conscripts. You have the issue, as the Chinese have long had, trying to forge a career NCO corps. They keep trying, they have yet to succeed. And a cultural bias that says, not all of our best and brightest are going to look upon serving in the military as your preferred path. Now, let me balance that, and this is very important. It may be a party army, but it is a professional military. These people have been very careful students. They are very patriotic. They are prepared and will fight and will die for their country as well as for the party. These are not, General Hersey's 100,000. These are not, illiterate, sort of bottom of the barrels. Their officers are motivated. They are educated. Many of them have a fair bit of exposure, at least, to the outside world, and they're increasingly technologically sophisticated. Bill Gates over there is probably not going to think much of joining the military. Of course, Bill Gates didn't join the military here either. So, but I think it's important to recognize these important cultural differences.
Hello, Alana with Booz Allen. I'm wondering if you think that China will continue to use its monopoly in rare earth minerals as leverage, and its increasing retention of natural resources as a way to press certain issues in foreign policies, and how to counter that in an international sphere.
Well, I think the rather ham-handed approach in 2010, the Chinese learned, didn't work very well. So in 2010, after a Senkaku's crisis with the Japanese, where a drunk Chinese fisherman rammed 2 Coast Guard vessels, the Japanese wanted to put him on trial. The Chinese were furious. The Japanese caved and actually returned the fisherman without a trial. And after they got the guy back, then they imposed a massive embargo of rare earths on Japan. That shocked the Japanese. If you want to know where today's Japanese military modernization effort is coming from, I would draw a straight line back to 2010. So 1, they learned that didn't work the way we thought. 2, they saw that, amazingly enough, the laws of supply and demand actually work. China is arguably more open to capitalism than some of our own universities. And I'm talking about the econ departments. They saw India, Canada, and the United States reopen rare earths, in part because the prices went up, and it was worthwhile. And so they actually stopped those controls. Also, the WTO filed multiple suits on this issue. Now, here's the irony. So Mountain Home, the one big US rare earths mine, I believe has now gone into receivership. And apparently nobody wants to prop them up and keep them open. I'm not sure about the Australian, Canadian, and Indian ones, but I suspect that there's probably something along those lines. I would hope that at a minimum, from a CFIUS perspective, if a nice Chinese company wanted to buy Mountain Home, we might say no. I'm not confident of that. And that hopefully would also be true in Australia, Canada, and elsewhere. More broadly speaking, the Chinese seem to have slowly constricted some of the exports of additional rare earths. But my understanding, and I'm not an expert on this, I'm not an economist and I don't play one on TV, DOD has said that there is not a rare earths problem. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here should be our planning horizon. In a 90-day war, I totally would accept that rare earths are not going to be a problem. There'll be lots of other things that would be beforehand. In a 3-year conflict, I'm not so sure we should be confident what is and isn't, what will and will not be shortages. I'd like to see us go back to thinking about mobilization. When I mentioned earlier about the CMC reorganization, they elevated mobilization to a general directorate, meaning there is a huge staff now whose job is to think about mobilization. That's only on the organizational side. I did a couple of studies on the subject back when I was at CNA. So I can say with confidence they have been seriously thinking about mobilization issues for at least the last 15 years. So rare earths, to my mind, is just one small piece of the larger industrial base issue of how long and how would we sustain a conflict against the PRC. How would we do it? What are substitutabilities? What is resiliency? All of those sorts of aspects. I think the Chinese are thinking very seriously about that. I'd like to hope that we would start as well.